Words appear on screen. Eunice Kennedy Shriver, 100, 1921 to 2021, A Legacy of Inclusion. The National Park Service logo appears in the lower right corner.
Hello.
A name title appears in the upper left corner. Jason Atzelis, Lead Park Ranger, Education Coordinator / Volunteer Coordinator. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, National Historic Site, National Park Service. Jason is dressed in a green suit and black tie.
I'm Jason Atzelis, Lead Park Ranger at John Fitzgerald Kennedy National Historic Site, a unit of the National Park Service. I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, A Legacy of Inclusion, as we celebrate Mrs. Shriver on the 100th anniversary of her birth. This program was made possible through collaboration between John Fitzgerald Kennedy National Historic Site, the site's Friends Group, Friends of the JFK Birthplace, and Special Olympics Massachusetts. And to all of our guests who so generously donated their time and without whom this program would not have been possible. We would also like to thank Brookline Interactive Group for their audio and video expertise in creating this filmed presentation. To all involved, we offer our heartfelt gratitude. Eunice Kennedy Shriver was born in her family's second home on Abbotsford Road in Brookline, just several blocks away from the JFK birthplace, which you see behind me. Mrs. Shriver's early childhood is tied to Brookline. She was born at 51 Abbotsford Road, baptized at St. Aidan's Roman Catholic Church, and attended one of the public schools of Brookline. Like all of her siblings, Eunice was raised to be well-rounded, competitive, and family-focused. She had keen political instincts and was instrumental in the campaigns of her brothers Jack, Bobby, Ted, and husband, Sergeant Shriver. Eunice also shared an especially close relationship with her older sister, Rosemary, who was born with intellectual disabilities. Today's program will feature two panel discussions, the first of which will focus on Eunice Kennedy Shriver's life, and the second on her legacy. We'll also have an opportunity to hear from disability rights advocates and those who were empowered and inspired by this amazing woman. Let us begin our program with the Town of Brookline Select Board member Bernard Green, who will offer remarks on behalf of the Brookline community, followed by keynote remarks from Mrs. Shriver's son and chairman of Special Olympics International, Dr. Timothy Shriver. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the program.
Welcome to the Town of Brookline.
A nameplate appears in the upper left corner. Bernard Green, Brookline Select Board member. Bernard is dressed in a gray suit and dark tie.
And today's program, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, 100, Legacy of Inclusion. This program is being held on the 100th anniversary of Eunice Kennedy's birth here in Brookline. I'm Bernard Green, a member of the Brookline Select Board and former chair of the Select Board. The subtitle of today's program, Legacy of Inclusion, speaks to an important value that we hold here in Brookline, inclusion. How inclusion became a legacy of Eunice Kennedy Shriver will enlighten us as to the broad, inclusive nature of the term inclusion, because Eunice's story cannot be told without including the story of her beautiful but disabled sister, Rosemary. Thank you for joining us for this virtual but very special program, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, 100, A Legacy of Inclusion.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tim Shriver, and I'm so proud to be joining all the friends of the National Park Service and the JFK birthplace.
A nameplate appears. Tim Shriver, PhD. Chair, Special Olympics International. Tim is wearing a dark suit and red shirt.
In this extraordinary celebration, this generous celebration, this joyful celebration of the 100th birthday of my mom, Eunice Kennedy Shriver. Now, it's almost impossible, as all of you will understand, to speak completely about one's mom, about a mother who gave so much to me, whose love, whose affection, whose connection, whose teaching, whose guidance, whose humor, whose smarts, whose bravery, whose grit, whose wild determination to make a difference. All of those things shaped me into who I am. I can't even separate myself from her and know the boundaries of her impact on me. But here's what I do know. She had some of that same effect on thousands, if not millions of others around the world. And it came from one core insight, in my view. I can remember from the earliest of my memories, 3, 4, 5 years old, whatever those first memories arise, my mother challenging me to get in the game. Come on, Timmy, let's get in the pool. Come on, Timmy, let's try to catch the ball. Come on, Timmy, let's go down into the woods and set off on an adventure. She wanted to be in the action. And when I think of those memories of helping me to swim and then pushing me from side to side and having me race my brothers and sisters on the side, from the sides to the pool, and then when I got bigger, the length of the pool, I hear the voice of someone whose determination to break through, to give me the strength to break through was constant. And when you look at the earliest pictures of her work in the field of intellectual disability, you see the same person. The first pictures we know of today of Camp Shriver are not pictures of her with the President of the United States or with ambassadors or senators announcing the formation of Camp Shriver. The pictures of her in the swimming pool with those campers in 1962 and 1963. Where were they coming from? Institutions. Where were they destined to live their lives? In institutions. What was her contribution? Get in the game, get in the pool, come with me. I will show you a different way. And when you see children of color in the pool in 1962 in her pool, when you think of the context in which this was happening, you see this radical energy of change, this determination to be completely undeterred by the boundaries that the culture had placed in her way, whether the boundaries were race or disability, all the conformities. She had no interest in any of them and was more than willing to smash through them on her own. Now, the life that she led was, of course, formed by her relationship with her sister Rosemary, who I am so grateful to this day that my grandparents chose to keep Rosemary at home. She was born almost a decade, Rosemary, before the Oliver Wendell Holmes decision that cast people with intellectual disabilities as being 3 generations of imbeciles, of idiots, of morons. 3 generations is enough. And off they went to the sterilization tables. Off they went into the institutionalized lives. And that's when Rosemary was born, and yet my grandparents kept her at home. And the gift of Rosemary being at home wasn't just a gift to Rosemary, it was a gift to all of her brothers and sisters, especially to my mom, because she learned at an early age that when you love someone and the culture doesn't get it, you fight the culture. When you love someone and society doesn't, you fight society. And when you love someone and you know they have gifts and the culture doesn't see them, you let a light shine on them. That was my mother's work. To fight the culture, to fight society, and shine a light on the gifts of people like my Aunt Rosemary, whose gifts were enormous and who are enormous. Gifts that are enormous, value that is irreplaceable, qualities that are necessary for all of us. My mom was so tough on these things, relentless, really, angry to a point, but determined to turn her anger into transformation, and not just into victimization and fighting. Over the course of the last 50 or 55 years since my mom started Camp Shriver, literally hundreds of millions of people have met their neighbors and their brothers and sisters with intellectual disability in swimming pools, just like I did, on soccer fields, in basketball gyms, on the side of snowy mountains. They have met there to play. The most primitive and important of childhood activities, to play, to imagine, to be in the game. And so many of us, like me, have learned from those moments of play that if we learn to play together, we can actually learn all of what is necessary to live together, to embark on new scientific journeys, to challenge ourselves to new ways of shaping communities, schools, places of work, recreational opportunities, healthcare systems, and on and on. We have learned by getting in the pool that when we are in it together, we find a way out together. We have learned, I dare say, from my mother, that there are no limitations to the gifts of the human spirit. She said so many quotable things, the beautiful Special Olympics oath that goes, "Let me win, but if I cannot win, let me be brave in the attempt." Remember that at her 100th birthday, brave in the attempt, brave, brave, brave. Never allowing the opposition of the culture or the society to defeat you. She said also, as we hope for the best in them, hope is reborn in us. Hope for the best in others. We are at a point in our culture and our history and our traditions where we are starving for hope. My mom would counsel, as I hear her counseling me even now, look for hope in others, look for the gift in another, and hope will be reborn in you. And she said to me over and over again, look out for, as she used to say, our special friends. Towards the end of her life, we were in China for the Special Olympics World Games. In 2007, the stadium was full, 70,000 people. The show was broadcast, I was told, 100 million viewers. The head of the Chinese government was there, Hu Jintao. She sat next to him in the stadium. The spotlights shone on her as the thousands and thousands of athletes poured into the stadium from over 150 countries, each representing the hopes and dreams of someone who had been left out. And as the spotlight shined on her, I thought to myself as I looked up from the field, this is her moment of great pride. This must be the moment in which she rests. To think that her dream, that her capacity to get into that pool with one child, teach him how to stretch his arms out, how to kick his legs, how to float, that singular gift had spread throughout the world. And later that night, we got back to the hotel and she was understandably tired. But her words to me stick with me still. What time do we have to get up in the morning? What venues are we going to see? Do you think the games will be a success? And I said, Mommy, the games already are a success. Look where we are. Look what's happening. And she turned her head and said, no, we have work to do. On this, her 100th birthday, I thank you for recognizing that we have work to do, a lot of work to do. I thank you for celebrating her, but mostly, I thank you for holding deep in your hearts, in your souls, in your minds, the determination to get into the pool yourselves. You're only watching this because you're already in there. So I thank you for her. I thank you with her. And I commit myself to joining you for however long each of us has to continue the work of recognizing the gifts in everyone. Happy birthday, Mom.
Welcome, everybody.
A nameplate appears in the upper left corner. Seth Blumenthal, PhD, Senior Lecturer, College of Arts and Sciences, Boston University. Friends of JFK Birthplace Program Board Member. Seth is wearing a white shirt.
To what I think, and what I think you'll soon find, is a fantastic panel of biographers and historians. Dr. Kate Clifford, Eileen McNamara, Jorge Matos Valdejuli, and as our moderator, Dr. Allison Carey. We're going to walk us through this really interesting relationship between Eunice and the disability rights movement.
It's great to be here to be able to celebrate Eunice's 100th birthday.
A nameplate appears in the upper left corner. Kate Clifford Larson, PhD, Brandeis WSRC Scholar, author, Rosemary, the Hidden Kennedy Daughter. Kate is wearing glasses, a blue blazer, and a red flower blouse.
Rosemary and Eunice were incredibly close, and I feel that in honoring Eunice, we are also honoring Rosemary's legacy. Rosemary, an intellectually disabled child in a household full of overachievers, was deeply loved by her siblings, and it was, in my mind, Eunice who bore much of the physical and emotional weight of Rosemary's difficult childhood and adulthood. Rose and Joe, their parents' attempts to raise Rosemary to fit in with the rest of her more capable siblings is both tragic and inspiring. It is clear, however, that the very existence of Rosemary deeply and profoundly affected the lives of all the Kennedys. Rose Marie, or Rosemary, or Rosie, as the family members called her, Kennedy was the third child and first daughter of Joseph and Rose Kennedy. Born in September in 1918, little Rosemary would soon show signs of intellectual impairment, setting her apart from her high-achieving siblings. Her parents were determined to provide her with the same educational opportunities shared by her brothers and sisters. She struggled and lagged behind her peers, however. Joe and Rose insisted that she be treated equally and included in every family activity. She suffered terrible emotional trauma, however, when Rose and Joe began sending her away to a series of boarding schools from the age of 11. She deeply missed her family, and she struggled with institutional and academic demands that were beyond her capabilities. She was also subjected to a variety of medical treatments under the mistaken belief that she could be cured. As she matured, her mental health suffered, causing her parents to seek more radical measures to control her. From a distance, Rosemary was in many ways an enchanting, typical girl of her time. On closer inspection, she was far more immature than her peers. She never mastered reading and writing beyond a third grade level. Her parents and siblings carefully orchestrated and controlled all her public appearances. She was never left alone. Eunice, and also her brothers Jack and Joe and sister Kathleen, and some paid companions and tutors accompanied her everywhere. By 1941, at the age of 23, she found those restrictions unbearable. She became angry and physically abusive. That year, she began escaping from a convent school that she had been sent to near Washington, D.C. Fearful that Rosemary's behavior would compromise the family's reputation and political future, Joe Kennedy made a horrific decision. He forced her to undergo a prefrontal lobotomy. At first, Rose was consulted. She refused to give her permission for the operation. Lobotomies were very new and still experimental, but under the terribly mistaken idea that it would help him control Rosemary and make her more compliant, Joe was swayed not only by his own desperate need to silence Rosemary, but by the procedure's most public and controversial proponent, Dr. Walter Freeman. The procedure was rarely successful, and it was never meant to treat intellectually disabled individuals. Rosemary had no voice in the decision. Her father had absolute control over her life. Unfortunately for Rosemary, her condition was mediated through deeply flawed notions and scientific understandings of intellectual disabilities and mental illness, more debilitating and damaging than curative. Women suffered the most at the hands of this institutional system and medical establishment. The surgery was a miserable failure, permanently disabling Rosemary and destroying her life as she had known it. Joe and Rose greatly feared that the public shame would derail the political aspirations of the Kennedy men. Institutionalized at St. Coletta's School in Jefferson, Wisconsin, Rosemary remained mostly hidden from her family and the public. Rose didn't visit her for almost 20 years, and she never wrote another word about Rosemary in her frequent lengthy correspondence to her children and friends during that time period. Her siblings were taught not to ask about her and to get on with their lives. Rosemary's disappearance from the fabric of the Kennedy family would irreversibly change them all forever. To me, it seems that 20-year-old Eunice and 9-year-old Teddy struggled the most in coping with the sudden absence of their sister. Jack secretly visited Rosemary in 1958 while campaigning through the Midwest during a presidential campaign. What he discovered changed him. Her life, however, would inspire him. Once elected president, and at Eunice's insistence, Jack helped usher in new government commitment to increasing resources for the physically and intellectually disabled of the nation, changing the lives of millions. Eunice believed that Rosemary's rejection had far more to do with the brilliance of Jack Kennedy's president, she said, than anyone understands. Rosemary's siblings loved her deeply and were severely affected by her treatment as a child. The rejection she faced, the disappointment she felt when she could not measure up, and the loneliness she endured. Her forced absence left a huge void in the family, but it also sparked action. Rosemary's tragedy created a path for her extended family to pursue meaningful, important work in the field of disabilities. Through national and international programs, agencies, and legislation, the Kennedys have facilitated and demanded substantial political and social change. Eunice and Ted believe that Rosemary's life sensitized them, quote, to the gifts of the vulnerable and the weak, and she taught them the worth of every human being.
There is no more neglected.
A nameplate appears. Eileen McNamara, professor of the practice of journalism, Brandeis University. Author, Eunice, the Kennedy who changed the world. Eileen is wearing glasses, a blue blazer, and a white turtleneck.
Kennedy, in my view, than Eunice. Rosemary certainly was a contributing factor to Eunice's passion in social justice and in pursuing the cause of children with intellectual disabilities. But I think it would be a mistake to think that that was all that motivated her. She was a formidable woman of considerable ambition, passion, and determination in her own right. Of all the Kennedy women, she's the only one who really got a serious university education. She was educated at Stanford University. And when she graduated, she went into public life almost immediately. When you think of Eunice Kennedy Shriver, of course, you think of the Special Olympics. But the Special Olympics is only part of her legacy. In many ways, Eunice Kennedy Shriver got to the issues of national importance years before her more celebrated brothers got there. In 1947, for instance, if you were to pick up a newspaper in Washington, D.C., and you were to see the Kennedy name in a headline, that story would not be about John, who was then a lackluster freshman congressman from Massachusetts. That story would be about Eunice, who was running a commission in the US Department of Justice on juvenile delinquency. She traveled all around the country denouncing the conditions in facilities for youthful offenders, just as she would years later decry the conditions for children who were warehoused in enormous brick institutions for children with intellectual disabilities. Yes, in 1961, when Bobby Kennedy became the US Attorney General, he too, at Eunice's insistent urging, took up the cause of juvenile delinquency. In 1950, Eunice was working at the only women's penitentiary in the federal penal system in West Virginia. There, she decried the conditions that separated mothers from their newborns. She asked, why was it that women who were guilty of economic crimes at the behest of their abusive boyfriends or husbands were incarcerated for long periods? Yes, 25 years later, Ted Kennedy raised those same issues when he was on the Senate Judiciary Committee. But it was Eunice who got there first. It was a difficult role to be a Kennedy woman in that family. Women were either invisible or decorative. Eunice was neither. She was a real force to be reckoned with. And the power that her father would not give her, she chose to take. She wrested control of the Kennedy Charitable Foundation, named for Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., who was killed in combat in World War II. With that control, she used her father's millions and her brother's political influence in order to contribute to one of the greatest civil rights movements of the 20th century, the fight for people with intellectual disabilities. She gave away millions of dollars of Joe Kennedy's money to universities so that they would study this issue. There was no federal money being appropriated to study why children were born with Down syndrome and other conditions that led to developmental delay. She used her brother's political influence as much as she could when her brother John was in the Senate to try to move the needle on getting federal involvement on this very critical issue. She did not stop there. Even before Jack Kennedy was elected president of the United States, she cornered him and said, should you reach the Oval Office, one of the first things you will do is create a president's panel on what we then called mental retardation. It was one of his first acts in January of 1961. He would not have done this of his own initiative. He did it because his sister insisted that he do it. That presidential panel was composed of some of the great minds of the 20th century in genetics and psychology, in medicine, in the law. Eunice Kennedy Shriver chose every one of those members. She led the panel's meetings, but she was not a member of the president's panel on mental retardation. Why? Well, years later, she said, well, it would be unseemly, wouldn't it, for the sibling of the president of the United States to have an official role in his administration. And we all know that Bobby Kennedy felt exactly the same way. She was used to a life behind the scenes, but oh, what she did behind the scenes in the Kennedy administration and in every administration that followed in the 88 years of her life. We remember her for Special Olympics, but maybe we don't remember that until 1975, a child with intellectual disabilities did not have a right to a seat in a public school classroom. They have that right today because of legislation drafted by Eunice Kennedy Shriver. Her name is not on any of these bills, but her energy is behind all of them. Within 2 years, the President's Panel on Mental Retardation created legislation, and Jack Kennedy signed this legislation. It was, in fact, sadly, the last piece of legislation he signed. It closed those warehouses for children. It shifted money to small, supportive group homes. It put federal money, not Kennedy money, into serious research on the causes of mental disabilities, of developmental delay. That's Eunice Kennedy Shriver's legacy. It doesn't even end there. As we know, 2 months before Jack Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Jacqueline Kennedy gave birth to their son, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy. Patrick was born 5 weeks prematurely. He was a robust 4.5 pounds, but his lungs had not completely developed. He would die within hours of hyaline membrane disease. 25,000 infants born prematurely died of hyaline membrane disease in 1963. Do you know almost no premature baby dies of that now? You know why? Because a year before his birth and tragic death, Patrick's aunt, Eunice, convinced her brother to create an Institute of Child Health and Human Development under the auspices of the National Health Institutes in Washington, D.C. The research that's been done there has put an end to hyaline membrane disease as a leading cause of death in premature infants. Today, that institute is named the Eunice Kennedy Shriver Institute for Child Health and Human Development, and for a good reason. Without Eunice Kennedy Shriver, there would be a lot more tragedies like that of Patrick Bouvier Kennedy in this world.
So today I'll be discussing...
On screen in the upper left, a nameplate appears. Jorge Matos Valdezuli, Assistant Professor and Reference Librarian. Hostos Community College Library, City University of New York. Jorge is wearing glasses and a blue shirt.
The issue of advocacy by parents and self-advocates of color within the disability rights movement. It'll mostly be based on my research about the Willowbrook State School in Staten Island, New York. On June 6, 1972, the then ABC News reporter Geraldo Rivera shook the nation's conscience with brutal film footage of the treatment of children and adults at the Willowbrook State School, an institution for the developmentally and intellectually disabled. In the aftermath of the scandal that followed, the campaign to close Willowbrook was primarily led by parent activists and their allies. Willowbrook's eventual closing in 1987 converted it into an iconic symbol of tragedy and resistance within the disability rights movement. But less known is the fact of how race was deeply intertwined with the development of the institution. Opened in 1947, Willowbrook's population reflected the massive racial transformation occurring in New York City following the Second World War, when thousands upon thousands of Blacks and Puerto Ricans migrated to the city. As a matter of fact, Just over 20% of Willowbrook's residents were of Black and Latino heritage, the largest minority population of any similar facility in New York State at the time. This population was also reflected in the parent activists of color who were at the helm of a multiracial leadership demanding the closure of Willowbrook. Their advocacy called for the establishment of a community-based system of group homes and support services as an alternative to confinement, neglect, and abuse so typical of the era. Some of these parent leaders included Willie Mae Goodman and Jose Rivera. They were leaders of one of the parent associations involved in the campaign to close Willowbrook, the Bouvier Parents Association. Willie Mae and Jose Rivera became a formidable force within the Willowbrook parents, representing the only parents association composed primarily of Blacks and Puerto Ricans, along with a few white families. But the Willowbrook struggle also saw the rise of self-advocates, such as Bernard Carabello. Bernard was a Puerto Rican man who spent 18 years at Willowbrook after being misdiagnosed and labeled mentally retarded, despite the fact that he was only impaired by a type of cerebral palsy which affected his mobility and speech. Bernard became the public face of the Willowbrook campaign, eventually becoming a leader in the independent living movement in New York and nationally. And this finally brings us to another notable leader that I wish to highlight within the independent living movement here in New York, by the name of Patricio Pat Figueroa. Patricio was an Afro-Puerto Rican man from the town of Cataño who migrated with his family to New York City in 1958. A key member of Disabled in Action, an early disability rights organization founded by Judith Heumann, the group was recently profiled in the Netflix documentary Crip Camp, which tells the story of a camp for disabled youth in upstate New York during the 60s and 1970s and its connection to the nascent disability rights movement at the time. Although hardly mentioned, Patricio appears in a few background scenes of the film, portraying Disabled in Action, but we never learn of his exploits fighting for accessibility in public transportation, higher education, and the founding of the first independent living center in New York State. These lamentable omissions of figures such as Patricio, Bernard, Willie Mae, and Jose Rivera continue to remind us of the historical contributions made by persons of color in securing fundamental rights for persons with and without a disability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jorge.
Seth Blumenthal.
Really
PhD.
inspirational stuff. And it's great to see ways in which Eunice's advocacy built a foundation on which we see the disability rights move in different directions. And we see also this push for a more grassroots effort. So we really see ways in which this is a turning point in American history, and the way that Eunice was at the center of that, but also on other unexpected places where it occurs. So thank you for that interesting perspective. And so now what we'd like to do is move to a Q&A session run by our moderator, who I will now introduce. So Dr. Allison Carey is a professor of sociology at Shippensburg University. Her research focuses on the history of civil rights for people with intellectual disabilities, including the role of family activism and self-advocacy.
Thank you, everyone. The talks.
A nameplate appears on screen in the upper left. Allison Carey, PhD, professor of sociology, Shippensburg University. Allison is wearing glasses and a pink blouse.
Great, and I'm looking forward to diving in. I'm going to ask each of you some questions, and also feel free if I've directed a question to one of you that somebody else wants to chime in, feel free to do that. So Kate, I want to go back and start with you. How did Joe and Rose think about disability, Rosemary's disability in particular, and how is that shaped by resources, both their own social class, right? They were a very wealthy and politically powerful family, but also the resources available or not
on
available
screen, Allison
to them
and the three
in
commentators
that era.
So Joe and Rose, in spite of their
Clifford
financial
Morrison,
resources, really had few options. There was maybe one or two schools for children with intellectual disabilities at the time. They were far away, and there was such little knowledge of the causes and how to educate and help children with intellectual disabilities at the time. So their teachers were not trained, and they grew frustrated with Rosemary, who could not keep up with her peers from the time she was, in preschool and beyond. And so Joe and Rose really, even though they could have paid for anything, there was nothing there for them. There were no resources targeted for their child, Rosemary. They also were influenced deeply by an understanding of people with disabilities, and it was not a kind world at the time, and it was very debilitating psychologically, and everything was just inaccurately described, and it made them feel some shame because they viewed themselves as very powerful and smart and active, and Rosemary did not match those ideals that they valued so much. So they were frustrated, very, very frustrated, and they sought a cure for her.
On screen, Allison and the three
and
commentators
that was
appear.
the debilitating part of the way that they tried to deal with what was going on with Rosemary.
Some historians have talked about that era as focusing on normalization and refer to it as kind of a
Allison Carey,
double-edged
PhD.
sword. So on the one hand, you see this idea of trying to include Rosemary, but only insofar as she can act like everyone else and fit in. And then if you can't fit within normalization, the other options are much more punitive and are, and include segregation. So can you reflect on that a little bit? Does that seem like it describes their options?
Right. I think you encapsulated that beautifully. I give a lot of credit to the Kennedys in
Kate
that
Clifford
they were
Larson,
very
PhD.
inclusive. The children grew up understanding that their family came first, the siblings came first, the older children taught the younger children. They were always included in everything, partly because Rose needed to keep all those kids together and control them in her own way. But they were very demanding about inclusion. And, Rosemary physically could not keep up with them either. She couldn't run as fast. She couldn't play tennis very well. She couldn't swim very well. She couldn't sail a boat very well. But all the other siblings had to include her. She had to be on their sailboats. They had to play tennis with her. So she was always included in everything that they did. So that was a good thing, except as she got older, it became more problematic. And that's when, from the age of 11 on, they started shipping her
On
off
screen,
and
Allison and the
segregating
three
her from the
commentators
family,
appear.
which had tragic consequences for Rosemary.
This next question is going to be for Kate and then Eileen. So siblings often have different perspectives than parents, both because
Allison
siblings
Carey,
relate
PhD.
to their sibling in a different way, and also eras are changing. They're growing up at a different time. So how was the perspective of Eunice in particular, maybe even Jack, Robert, and Jorge, I'll loop back to you in a moment after this, different than the vision of Joe and Rose? How did they see disability differently?
I know
On
Joe
screen,
and Jack,
Allison and the
the
three
oldest
commentators
brothers,
appear.
were very
Kate Clifford
protective
Larson,
of Rosemary. They treated her in that way. They made her feel special. She loved them deeply. And so they were very protective. The next sister, Kathleen, or Kick, I sense she resented the responsibility that she was required to take on to be a companion to Rosemary. So it fell to Eunice, who was even younger, who carried forward with that. And then the much younger siblings, particularly the girls, they were not really as attached to Rosemary. Teddy, the youngest, appears to have been the most emotional about Rosemary and viewed her in a different light than his older siblings.
And Eileen, can you
Allison
add
Carey,
on to that? I
PhD.
feel like Eunice shifts the conversation about disability in really fundamental ways from the kinds of thinking of her parents. Can you talk more about that?
On screen,
I think she
Allison and
does.
the
I
three
think that
commentators
she
appear.
sees the fundamental human
Eileen
rights
McNamara.
of every person, whatever their abilities or lack thereof, to be recognized by society. And I think that there's a misconception about Eunice that she was a wonderful philanthropist, you know, this rich heiress who spent all of her time caring about the concerns of others. She was a really difficult woman. And I think she was propelled as much by rage as she was by compassion, maybe more. And the rage was the fact that her sister was erased from the family. And there was complicity there too. She and her siblings acquiesced to their father's insistence that we not speak of Rosemary anymore. It was Eunice, of course, who brought her back into the heart of the family after Joe died. It was at Eunice's house in Hyannisport that she spent the summer. It was with Eunice in the winter that she visited. The siblings came to see her at Eunice's house. Part of that is her Catholicism. I don't think you can underestimate the power that that played in their lives. Rose was a very pious Catholic, as we know, but her piety was of a very different sort than Eunice's. Eunice really did want to change the world and public perception of people with disabilities. And she did that later in her life when her husband, Sergeant Shriver, developed Alzheimer's. She dragged Sergeant Shriver to every public event that she attended, and she expected everybody to treat him with the same respect that they had treated him when he was the director of the Peace Corps. She gave no quarter. And I think she wasn't as progressive as people are now about self-advocacy. She was too a woman of her time. But let's not forget, when we talk about race and class, that the precursor to Special Olympics was Camp Shriver, which she created in 1962 in the backyard. None of us have a backyard like this, on her estate in suburban Maryland. And on that estate, the children that swam in her pool,
On screen,
that played
a
on her
picture of Eunice
basketball
Kennedy Shriver
court,
helping
that
a young man
rode
into the
the
swimming
Shriver
pool.
family horses, were more likely to be Black than white. And this is 1962, when Maryland is a segregated state. It is a year before Jack Kennedy proposes a civil rights bill to end segregation. So she was progressive on a lot of things and not so progressive. To the end of her life, she called people with intellectual disabilities her special friends. And I know that that made self-advocates cringe. But in her defense, she was a woman of her time. And we wouldn't have gotten to the era of self-advocacy
On
if we
screen,
hadn't
Allison and the
had
three
Eunice to
commentators
lead us
appear.
there.
So when we think about that balance of fighting for rights, fighting for services, for recreational
Allison Carey,
opportunities,
PhD.
for charity, for research, where did her priorities, across that, where did her priorities lie?
Well,
On
I think
screen, Allison and the
fundamentally,
three
she wanted the
commentators
federal
appear.
government to
Eileen
acknowledge
McNamara.
that the government had a role to play in the lives of these citizens. These were American citizens who were being ignored. And she learned pretty quickly in the late 50s, when she hijacked the Kennedy Foundation, that one family foundation could not solve the problems that confronted this population. So I think she was really driven to make the federal government and make the American people confront the reality that this country is made up of lots of different kinds of people, and they all have a stake in this democracy. And this democracy has a
On
stake in
screen,
them.
Allison and the three commentators appear.
And Jorge, thinking about the siblings, Robert Kennedy had some involvement with Willowbrook. Can you talk about that and how he got involved in Willowbrook?
So Robert
Jorge
Kennedy
Matos
in
Valdezuli.
1965, as a senator for the state of New York, visited Willowbrook, sort of a surprise visit. And it's unclear exactly how he gets to that. I think there are a number of different factors, and one of them is some connections to the mental retardation panel, commissioned by his brother, John F. Kennedy. But nevertheless, Robert Kennedy publicly denounces the conditions at the Willowbrook State School, much to the chagrin of Governor Nelson Rockefeller and the director of the Willowbrook State School, which immediately went on the defense. What's interesting about that is that although the scandal was active, let's say, for a few months, unfortunately it went away, but it was already sort of the first shot, right, and the first public denunciation of the actual conditions at Willowbrook. And you know, there's very famous statements that he made to a New York State legislature commission, which are, you know, the words are very powerful, right? The denunciation was very much reminiscent of all of the different abuses we understand of the systems of state schools, right? And the kind of treatment of children and adults that, you know, became so common.
Allison and the
So he
three
was definitely,
commentators appear.
you know, at the forefront of this sort of critique of the system, right? But in terms of my research, what's interesting is that his denunciation then opens up another smaller scandal. The Willowbrook State School had a smaller
Allison and the three
smaller
commentators appear.
institution in the Lower East Side of Manhattan called the Bouvier Division of the Willowbrook State School. It had formerly been the Bouvier Hospital, a former public hospital which was closed and which was in very need of repair. But in the early 60s, New York State health authorities decided to move over 200 children, the most severely disabled, at Willowbrook State School, and they were composed of mostly Black and Puerto Rican children. And this is what's interesting is that because Robert Kennedy makes these public critiques,
Allison and the three commentators
there,
appear.
the press then finds out of similar conditions at this other institution in the Lower East Side, which was a part of Willowbrook. And so I think that it's very important to put that into context, that you know, Robert Kennedy sort of was the spark.
Allison and the three commentators appear.
So Robert Kennedy's providing the spark. Eunice has helped promote the presidential
Allison
panel
Carey,
on rights for people with mental retardation. So we're seeing this movement towards rights and reimagining a much more positive world for people with disabilities at the same time that we're seeing the perpetuation of institutions and actually the growth of institutions. Can you talk a little bit about how those coexist? Why Willowbrook is still happening at the same time? Is it just a time lag that there hasn't been enough time to really think about what rights mean for people?
From, you know, sort of a national picture of the history of the development of state schools throughout the United States, and state schools being the institutions that warehouse people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. As some of you may be aware, after World War II, there's an exponential growth in these institutions throughout the United States. But I can at least speak to the situation in New York. The Willowbrook State School was supposed to be a state-of-the-art school, which was supposed to sort of address the issue of overcrowding, right, in New York State institutions for the disabled. Being that New York State had some of the largest numbers of warehouse children and adults in these institutions. So Willowbrook was supposed to address that, but already by the late 50s and early 60s, it is overcrowded, limited funding, rampant disease and abuse and death that's taking place at the institution. But what's interesting as well in terms of institutionalization is what's less known in terms of the links with race and class in New York City. As New York City is sort of transforming itself in terms of the communities that are now taking the brunt of poverty and racism within the city, Black and Puerto Rican communities, this is interestingly noted by a 1960 New York State report on institutionalization in New York City and the number of factors why that was occurring. And one of the things that they find that's fascinating, that's once again little known even within the Willowbrook literature, is that the report comes to the conclusion that there's a disproportionate share of African American and Puerto Rican children that are being institutionalized at this time, that there's a correlation between poverty and race and institutionalization. And part of that had to do with the way IQ tests were being used within the public school system. And as many of us know, there's a very sort of dark history of IQ tests and its discriminatory impact, especially upon African-American children, but at that time, especially on children, Puerto Rican children that were coming in whose first language was Spanish. So many of these IQ tests, which at the time sort of documented officially that many of these children were of lower IQ, right? A number of different factors coalesced, right, including within the criminal justice system, that sort of funneled, right, a lot of children of color
On screen, Allison and the three commentators appear.
Into places like the Willowbrook State School.
So when we get these institutions and we get the a growth of
Allison
parent
Carey,
activism
PhD.
around them, Eileen, I'm going to go back to you for a moment. What was the relationship between the Kennedys and the parents' movement, like the ARC? Were they part of that? Did they remain a little separate from it? How did they interact with
On
parent
screen,
activists?
Allison and the three
The
commentators
parents'
appear.
movement actually predates
Eileen McNamara.
a lot of this. I mean, it really begins in the late 40s and the early 50s. And the reason that Eunice was able to name all these experts to the president's panel on mental retardation is because she went to those parental advocates who helped her, who taught her. She spent all of her career giving fulsome praise to the parents who pushed back against their doctors. You had asked a question earlier about how is it that all of this, that political activity and legal activity is happening and change seems to be so slow? Well, the culture takes a while to catch up with the law. It always does in all of these rights movements. And it certainly did in this case for children with intellectual disabilities. They might be told they had a right to a seat in a public school classroom by 1975. That didn't mean that there was one there in every school district in this country. And I think the parents and the advocates, like people like Eunice Kennedy Shriver, who were fighting for those concrete signs of progress, were often frustrated. I mean, we don't have the Americans with Disabilities Act until 1990. And in the original drafts of that bill, it did not cover people with intellectual disabilities. It was all about sidewalk curbs for people in wheelchairs. Her name isn't on that bill either, but all of the drafters whose names are on that bill will tell you that the reason that people with intellectual disabilities did get included was because Eunice wouldn't stand for the bill getting to the floor of the Senate without them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then Jorge, when we look at the parents' movement, the scholarship around the parents' movement, we see a lot of representation of white families, of middle-class families. You are documenting this multi-ethnic, multiracial collaboration alliance. What are the challenges that parents of color face in having their activism recognized and in making changes still today?
You know, as many of us obviously know, or at least especially at this moment historically, that parents with children with disabilities or other family members with disabilities are also having to face a number of other challenges related to racism and classism in public health, for example, or in housing or employment, for example. So especially with regards to some of the work I've been doing, the Black and Latino parents in New York City at the time were having to deal with very serious substandard delivery of public health services in New York City, despite having one of the most sort of elaborate public health systems in the country. There were many issues facing the public health system in New York with regards to substandard funding and substandard service to the newer communities or larger communities of African Americans and Puerto Ricans, and the other, of course, factor in this is that there's a massive outmigration of white ethnic families
On screen,
to
Allison
suburbia.
and the three
There's
commentators
also a
appear.
massive transfers of wealth that are undergirding this massive shift in population. And the other major challenge that parents of color were facing at that time and still face today, that's very much sort of related to public health, is housing and discrimination in housing, right? Either explicitly or implicitly due to particular ways that housing is available for those with lower incomes. So those are some of the issues that were most pressing. But I would also add that as once again at this particular historical moment, one of the things that parents of color continue to face with children or relatives with intellectual and developmental disabilities is, of course, within the criminal justice system. Right. So not only do parents of color have to worry about access to services or access to public education for their relatives, but they also have to worry about a criminal justice system that is extremely punitive against a disproportionate share of Black and Latino persons, right? And it's, but many of you already are aware of the rates of disability, and whether it's psychiatric or intellectual, physical or otherwise, the rates of disability of people within the criminal justice system are very, very high. So that there's not only a violence in terms of the lack of services available to people of color, but there's a direct violence by the state, such as by the police and the criminal justice
On screen,
system,
Allison and the three
that
commentators appear.
families have to face.
We only have a few minutes left, so I actually want to ask one last question. So bringing in what Jorge was talking
Allison
about, it's
Carey,
interesting that
PhD.
Eunice talked about incarceration. She talked about the social welfare system. She talked about civil rights. She talked about disability rights. At the time, they were often, though, segmented, right? And now we're at the point where we're seeing those really come together. And so, Eileen, I'm wondering if you can wrap us up by thinking about where we're at in Eunice's legacy, right? What we've accomplished and what's still left on the table.
On
in a few
screen,
minutes.
Allison and the three commentators
and
appear.
Eunice herself would say that the work is never done.
Mhm.
And it certainly wasn't done in her lifetime. She died in 2009. And her son Timothy runs Special
Eileen
Olympics
McNamara.
now. Her son Anthony runs Best Buddies. Her son Mark runs Save the Children. So she raised the next generation of advocates. All of them are deeply involved with advocacy for people with intellectual disabilities. And I think they're poignantly aware that all of the issues that we've discussed today, race, class, the lack of access to public health resources, are integrated. It's all part of one story, the story that is the story of Eunice Kennedy Shriver's life, which is that all people, whatever their abilities or disabilities, are equal members of this society.
Thank you.
On screen, a slide that reads, next up, 3 advocates for people with intellectual disabilities. Friends of the JFK birthplace invite you to help them support programs like this one. jfkfriends@gmail.com, 617-566-7937, extension 16.
Hello, my name is Marlene Sayo, and I'm the Executive Director of the Disability Law Center.
A nameplate appears in the upper left corner. Marlene Salo, Executive Director, Disability Law Center, Boston, Massachusetts. Marlene is wearing glasses and a blue and white striped top.
The Disability Law Center is Massachusetts' protection and advocacy agency, and we fight for the rights of people with disabilities throughout the Commonwealth. I am also a 1986 graduate of Manhattanville College, a school that holds a very dear place in my heart, not only to me, but to the Kennedys. I remember first arriving at Manhattanville and hearing about the Kennedy legacy. The most important and I think most influential part of those conversations was the knowledge that Eunice had established the Special Olympics. So much so that they actually brought the Special Olympics chapter to Manhattanville College. And I had the fortune of actually volunteering one summer and helping out with some activities on campus. And that ultimately led to my interest in becoming a special education teacher. As a result of my volunteer work, I ended up taking some classes, education classes, while at Manhattanville. I even worked with some young boys in the local elementary school who had special education and behavioral needs. And through that program, I ultimately moved forward and got my teaching certificate in special education. And I worked in special ed for several years before becoming an attorney and then specializing in disability law. I think the most important point for me in my years at Manhattanville was in 1984 when President Reagan awarded Mrs. Shriver the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
A black and
which
white
we all
photo is
know
shown.
is the
President
nation's
Reagan
highest
presenting Eunice Kennedy
civilian
Shriver
honor.
the Presidential Medal of
And
Freedom.
she received this medal for her work on behalf of persons with intellectual disabilities. Now, fast forward to where I am today. I'm at the Disability Law Center, which is Massachusetts Protection and Advocacy Agency. And it was put in place back in the early 1970s as a result of not our agency, but the P&A system overall, as a result of an investigation that took place at Willowbrook State School in New York City's institution for people with developmental disabilities. And at Willowbrook, we had over 6,000 individuals residing there, residents, even though the hospital was built for 4,000 residents. But they were housed like if they were just thrown away by society. And one of the things that struck me in doing the research about the P&A system when I first started was that Robert Kennedy, while a US Senator in New York, actually paid an unannounced visit to the institution, and he denounced its conditions. And obviously Kennedy had an interest in institutions like that because of his sister Rosemary, who was developmentally disabled. And I recall what Robert Kennedy said in the research that I conducted, and he described the facility as a situation that borders on a snake pit. A very accurate description. As a result of Willowbrook being taken down based on investigative reporting done by Bruce Ennis as well as Geraldo Rivera, Congress woke up and decided to establish protections for individuals with developmental disabilities and establish the protection and advocacy system. So as of right now, we have a P&A in every single US state, all US territories, and a Native American P&A. And we all advocate for the rights of all people with disabilities. And we receive funding from the US government to address the needs of individuals with disabilities throughout the Commonwealth and throughout the US. So I would say that as a result of my experience at Manhattanville, my knowledge about the Kennedy women, especially Eunice's passion for Special Olympics and my ability to even volunteer for Special Olympics, it led a career path for me that ultimately allowed me to be the executive director of the Disability Law Center, Massachusetts Protection and Advocacy System. And I thank Eunice for that.
My son was born.
A nameplate appears in the upper left. Evelyn Milloran, disability advocate, mother of adult son with autism, Medford, Massachusetts. Evelyn is wearing glasses and a yellow blazer.
After 2 years, that's when it was a different child that we known before. After several years of medical evaluation, no one could tell us what was wrong with him. At the age of 7, he went for another medical evaluation with 10 doctors. After 5 days through the evaluation, they decided to tell us to put him in an institution. I decided not to listen to them, and I said no, I categorically refuse. A year later, that's when he was diagnosed with autism. At that time, no one knew what autism was. But with the care and the nurturing, living in a family life that we provide for him, he started to make progress. While he was in school, through the special education, I learned about Mrs. Shriver. He participated twice in Special Olympics as a young boy and as a teenager. After he was diagnosed with autism, then I started to be very inquisitive, very curious. No one knew what autism, what the word meant at that time. And I learned all I could learn and get involved with different disabilities, organization on disability issue to help parents navigate this fragmental system. And by that time, he went to school, he learned how much he could learn. And as a parent, we are helping him to move forward. In 2000, my son and with us made a leap of faith. He moved into his own apartment, exceeded everyone's expectation, learned how to take public transportation and go to work to Burlington Mall on his own. And this is then I continue to get involved with many different disability organizations. I travel, I speak, I've been a motivative speaker. And in 2002, I decided to apply for the Kennedy Fellowship. And this program began by Mrs. Shriver to encourage the importance of the political process. The foundation brings fellows to 1 year in Washington to learn how policies made on disability issues. Fellows learn how to create, pass laws and regulation to enhance the life of people with disabilities. I had the privilege to meet Mrs. Shriver in October 2002, after being selected to be one of the Kennedy Fellows. My personal meeting with her in her office was very delighted and enlightening. She was very informed of world events, including the turbulence from my homeland, Haiti. She only asked me one question about my decision not to put my son in a mental institution. My answer to her was love. And at that time, I realized no one could have the patience to care for my son. The task was too cumbersome. As a little boy, for 5 years, he only slept for 2 hours. After my answer, she stated to me, she visited 2 mental institutions and said, I quote, "The horrific images and inhuman conditions of those individuals will vividly engrave in her memory for the rest of her life." 2 weeks after my meeting with her, I received a personal phone call to let me know that I will be one of the Kennedy Fellows for the year 2000 and 2003. I did my fellowship in the Department of Special Education and the Parent Program, and I was honored to be elevated to get the recognition on national levels. I participated with Congress in the reauthorization of the Individual with Disabilities Education Act. That year shaped my life for the better. What I like to convey, Mrs. Shriver's legacy is a blueprint for my life. I am very grateful for the opportunity. I look at her as someone who was determined to convey to the world that people with intellectual disabilities deserve the opportunity to live with dignity and to become a productive citizen, just like my son. Thank you.
We are so pleased to welcome Deborah Robinson.
A nameplate appears in the upper left. Allison Carey, PhD, Professor of Sociology, Shippensburg University. Allison is wearing glasses and a blue and white top.
Deborah Robinson is Director of Speaking for Ourselves, Pennsylvania's self-advocacy organization. She has led Speaking for Ourselves to become a nationally recognized organization. She was present at the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, appointed to the National Council of Disabilities by President Clinton in 1995, and she served the American Association of People with Disabilities. So welcome, Debbie. Deb, parents and family members have played an important role in establishing disability rights. Why is it so important to also have self-advocates as part of the disability rights movement?
Because we're...
A nameplate in the upper left appears. Deborah Robinson, Executive Director, Speaking for Ourselves. Deborah is wearing a black and white top.
We're a part of society, and the services is about us. Without us, they have a right because it's their lives that we're talking about. It's their lives that we're trying to change. It's their lives we're trying to give them the encouragement to stand up for their rights, and you know, get the support and services that they need.
And so thinking
Allison
about
Carey,
the work of
PhD.
Speaking for Ourselves today, what are some of the main issues that Speaking for Ourselves continues to work on regarding disability rights?
Well,
Deborah Robinson.
We're working on serving on boards, serving on committees, educating, getting people involved, also sharing information, and supporting each other and teaching each other. The members of Speaking for Ourselves are the driving force of our organization, and we're independent. We have an independent board run by and for people with disabilities. So this is why it's really important to have self-advocates involved, because we have a lot to say, and we support our members. We're at their meetings. We help them get around to the services that they need. This is complicated. This is, through the city of Philadelphia, without their support, I was able to get devices under the COVID so people could stay connected to each other, so they can see their friends on Zoom and learn how to use the technology that's out there. Without Speaking for Ourselves or the supporters that supported me in this movement, and family members, Visions for Equality, you know, this a whole list of people that supported us in our advocacy work, and because they believed in what we were doing, they believed in us. Without that, I don't know where we would have been without that support. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for all your work, Deborah.
Welcome everyone to our panel discussion.
A nameplate appears in the upper left. Melody Mendez, anchor, NBC 10 Boston, NECN. Melody is wearing a red blouse.
Exploring Eunice Kennedy Shriver's vast legacy, especially involving support and advocacy for people with intellectual and other disabilities. My name is Melody Mendez. I'm a news anchor for NECN and NBC 10 Boston, and I'm truly honored to be speaking with representatives of these three organizations with direct ties to Mrs. Shriver, to the Special Olympics, the Eunice Kennedy Shriver Center at UMass Medical School, the Special Olympics, of course, and the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, which is part of the National Institutes of Health. So I'd like to take a moment to briefly introduce our panelists today. Their resumes are long, so we've shortened them up a touch, but there's a lot more behind them. Mary Beth Mcmahon is the president and CEO of Special Olympics Massachusetts.
A nameplate appears in the upper left. Mary Beth Mcmahon, president and CEO of Special Olympics Massachusetts. Mary Beth is wearing a blue shirt.
A year-round sports training and competition organization for individuals with intellectual disabilities. Mary Beth's been with the organization, serving in a variety of roles, both volunteer and staff, for more than 35 years. Tyler Legassi is an award-winning Special Olympic athlete from Tingsboro, Mass.
A man and a woman appear on screen with a nameplate. Tyler and Deb Legassi, award-winning Special Olympics athlete, and his mother. Tyler is wearing glasses and a black shirt. Deb is wearing glasses and a black blouse.
I had the chance to meet him a few weeks back. He is a 6 handicap golfer, for those of you who don't play. That means he's really, really good. He's the co-author of his autobiography, What Do You Say? Autism with Character. He's an honorary ESPY Award recipient and 2019 graduate of UMass Lowell. Dr. Jean Frazier.
A nameplate appears on screen. Jean Frazier, MD, Executive Director, Eunice Kennedy Shriver Center. Jean Frazier is wearing a blue blouse and glasses.
Is the executive director of the Eunice Kennedy Shriver Center at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. She is a tenured professor of psychiatry and pediatrics and holds the Robert M. and Shirley S. Siff Endowed Chair in Autism. Her research centers on advancing the understanding, the diagnosis, and treatment of a variety of neurodevelopmental disorders, including autism and Fragile X syndrome. She also has a sister who has Down syndrome. Dr. Carol Curtin is the Associate Director of the Eunice Kennedy Shriver Center.
A nameplate appears on screen. Carol Curtin, PhD, LICSW, Associate Director, Eunice Kennedy Shriver Center. Carol is wearing glasses and a black shirt.
And directs several programs within the Shriver Center, including its large leadership education in neurodevelopmental disabilities program. It's called the LEND program. Her research is focused on promoting healthy lifestyles in individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, with a specific focus on nutrition, physical activity, and weight management. Carol is a clinical social worker by training with a PhD in clinical and population health research. She's also a family member of several neurodiverse individuals. Dr. Diana Bianchi is director of the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development.
A nameplate appears on screen. Diana Bianchi, MD, director of the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. Diana is wearing glasses and a black blouse.
One of 27 institutes and centers at the NIH in Bethesda, Maryland. She's a pediatrician and a scientist whose career has been dedicated to improving the health of pregnant women, premature babies, and children with genetic conditions. And on behalf of this pregnant woman, I really appreciate all of the work that you do, Diana, and that you all do and have done. So look, my hope is really that we come away from this conversation with a sense of how Mrs. Shriver impacted these three organizations, as well as your own personal involvement. And perhaps we can hear a story or two about Mrs. Shriver from either your own experience or maybe something that's been passed down to you from other colleagues that knew her. So I'm going to pose a few questions to get the conversation started. Not everyone may end up responding to each one, but we'll count on each one of you to share more about one or more aspects of her legacy, since there is so much to talk about and so much to dive into. So let's get right to it. The first question is for all of you. Please tell us a little about yourself and specifically what motivated you to take part in this program commemorating the 100th anniversary of Eunice Kennedy Shriver's birth. Why don't we start with Mary Beth Mcmahon?
Thank you, Melody. Actually, ironically, yesterday I just did a commencement speech at my high school alma mater, and this exact question was what somebody asked me. I got involved with Special Olympics completely by accident. Many people assume I have a family member. I do not. I got involved in college and had the incredible luck of meeting Mrs. Shriver back in the early 90s. Mrs. Shriver was one of the hardest people I've ever worked for, mainly because she really believed in equality for all. And she felt that the playing field of sports was a place where we were all equal, no matter what your intellectual capabilities were. And so that was the platform she ran on. And I think that's the legacy we try to continue here at Special Olympics every day. And she was the toughest person I've ever worked for, and have plenty of stories to share with you later. But I think the key with Mrs. Shriver is that she never took no for an answer. She always felt there was more we could accomplish. There was always more we could do. And I don't think she'd ever be happy until we had every individual with intellectual disabilities out playing in sports somewhere in this world. And to this day, I always think to myself, what would Mrs. Shriver say? And in fact, in the pandemic, when I had to cancel summer games for the first time ever, I was like, she is not going to be happy with this decision. So I think that's the legacy I live with her. It's always like, is Mrs. Shriver going to be okay with this decision? And if not, how can I make sure she would be in honoring, her legacy to this movement?
Let's go to Tyler. Tyler, how about you?
Well, I've been involved with Special Olympics
Tyler
since
and
I was in my
Legassi.
teens. I was introduced to Special Olympics while playing basketball with kids in disability sports based out of Lowell. And Special Olympics has allowed me to go to lots of different places and meet new people and open up new avenues of possibilities for myself and my family, my mother included. Speaking of Eunice's 100th birthday, simply put, this celebration can only happen once, which makes it all the more special. And we're celebrating the life of an individual who brought people like me out of our shells to give us something to hope for, something to work for, something to live for, and ultimately something to be proud of. And that's all I can say about that.
Beautiful, Tyler. Thank you. How about Dr. Frazier?
Thank you, Melody. Sorry. So
Jean
it's
Frazier,
such a delight
MD.
to be a part of this this opportunity today. And I just have to say that like Eunice, I am a sister of a wonderful individual who has a developmental disability, Carol. She has Down syndrome and has really influenced much of what I've done throughout the course of my life. I think it's in large part due to my experience with Carol that I went into child psychiatry so that I could help individuals with developmental disabilities lead fuller lives. I really concentrate on trying to help individuals who have autism and Down syndrome and other disabilities who have co-occurring psychiatric disorders so that they're adequately treated. I have followed Carol. She actually started Special Olympics at the earliest age possible. And she was involved in track and field and was just a terrific swimmer. And the thing that I delighted in was seeing her on the award ceremony stand with her medals and the delight in her eyes and the confidence that she gained through the years through participation in the Special Olympics. And we all owe our gratitude to Eunice for her passion and perseverance in starting this wonderful organization. I've admired Eunice my whole life from afar. And what an honor to be able to celebrate her 100th birthday together.
Dr. Curtin, do you want to follow up next?
Sure, and thank you for this opportunity. Like Jean, I'm
Curtin,
delighted to be a part of
PhD,
it.
LSCSW.
And when we got an email from Mark Schwartz asking if we would be interested in helping with the 100th birthday of Mrs. Shriver, we jumped at the chance because the work that we do at the Shriver Center really embodies what she set out to do decades ago, and it's been an honor to work at the Shriver Center and to try to fulfill what she envisioned, which is full inclusion for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in every aspect of life and in the community. And so we just naturally wanted to be a part of the celebration and to pay tribute and to honor her and her legacy.
Dr. Bianchi.
Thank you, Melody. I mean, when Mark invited me to be
Diana
part of
Bianchi,
this celebration, I also jumped at it as I do direct this institute that is named for Mrs. Shriver. And it was really her work that resulted in a task force that convinced Congress that a separate NIH institute was needed, not only to address the needs of children and normal development, but also atypical development, and really advocating for research to improve the lives of children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So it was this 1961 task force that actually led to the institute, as well as the university affiliated centers that Jean and Carol represent. And it was her passion that convinced her brother, President Kennedy, to really push for it. And I shared a photograph with Mark of the day that the legislation, that the president signed the bill, actually, that resulted in the formation of the centers and the institute. And he's handing the pen over to his sister.
On screen, a black and white photograph of President Kennedy
beaming.
handing Eunice Kennedy Shriver pen surrounded by
Her legacy is enormous. From her passion really came this completely new field of research on people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to improve their lives. So it's a real honor to participate.
Okay, I want to go to the second
Melody
question
Mendez.
because it sounds like, in hearing what everyone has to say, it's a real honor to even be in the field that she really started and had such a huge impact on, and has left us with such a huge legacy. So I know there's a lot to get to. I want to start this next question with Tyler, and then I'll open it up to the rest of you. So the question is, what impact does Mrs. Shriver have on your roles in the disability movement? Tyler specifically, what is her impact on you as a Special Olympics athlete and a spokesperson?
Well, before Special
Tyler and
Olympics,
Deb
there was
Legassi.
a time when people in my circle never thought that I would graduate high school, let alone hold 2 college degrees. As an athlete and spokesperson, safe to say that Eunice would have been proud of me for overcoming obstacles, beating the odds, and believing in myself. And that goes for all the Special Olympians triumphing over their own struggles. And
Does anyone else want to weigh in on this?
Melody
What
Mendez.
impact does Mrs. Shriver have on your role within the disability movement?
So I can speak to this, being that I'll follow Tyler
Mary
here for a
Beth
second.
Mcmahon.
I think, like I mentioned, Mrs. Shriver just had this way of making sure every staff member or every volunteer in this organization saw the ultimate goal of getting everybody on the playing field from the age of 2 to 93. And I think that was her legacy to us, is that she, no matter what age, no matter what ability, there was a place for you in Special Olympics. And I think we challenge ourselves, especially coming through the pandemic, which ironically is, we're coming out of it around the same time as her 100th birthday. And to think that she would have been overlooking us and saying, get everybody back out and involved now. It wouldn't have mattered to her that there was a human nature side of coming back out. It wouldn't have mattered to her that colleges were saying to us, can't host hundreds of people. It wouldn't have mattered. She would have been all over us to try and make sure we were back out and involved as quickly and as possible as we can, because in her eyes, no only meant yes. It truly was an impeccable ability for her to just accept no. And so I think if you ever went in and said no to her, you might not be here anymore. But it was just, she just had the highest expectations, and every one of us really worked to achieve them. And then when you achieve them, she just set the bar higher. And so I think that every one of us, the organization is where it is today because the core group of volunteers and staff that drive it know that she would never be happy. She would always want more. And I think that's what drives every athlete in Special Olympics and every other participant in Special Olympics.
So from a personal perspective,
Diana Bianchi,
as part of my
Kennedy.
training, my early research efforts were funded by the Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Research Center at Boston Children's Hospital. So I think that having that funding and support, which again resulted from her efforts in the 1960s, influenced my choice of research. And what we're doing in my own research laboratory right now is taking a personalized medicine approach to help with improving independent life skills for people with Down syndrome. Now, I never met Mrs. Shriver, but I certainly have worked with her son, Tim Shriver, and Mary Beth obviously knows him as well. I'm a big believer in the power of DNA, and I feel like he very often channeled his mother. He served on our advisory council, and he did the exact same thing that Mary Beth was talking about. He was always challenging me and our staff, what more can we do? We need to include people who have intellectual and developmental disabilities in all of our research projects. They should not be excluded. They are human beings who need to derive the benefits from all of the research that we're doing at the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development.
I'd like to hear more
Melody
for a moment
Mendez.
about Mrs. Shriver's involvement in the actual establishment, development, and obviously growth of your three organizations.
On screen is a
Perhaps
six-person
maybe
shot
one of each,
with
a
Melody
representative
Mendez
of
in the upper
each
left
organization can speak
surrounded
to
by
this
5
specifically.
panelists.
I can speak to the Eunice Kennedy Shriver Center at UMass Medical
Carol
School.
Curtin, PhD,
So Dr.
LICSW.
Bianchi kind of foreshadowed, how the Shriver Center came to be. We are a University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities that we call a UCED. But back in the day, they were called University Affiliated Facilities. And those came about as a result of Mrs. Shriver's efforts and her vision that there needed to be a federal infrastructure devoted to research, training, and service for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So as Dr. Bianchi said, she prevailed upon her brother to develop the president's panel on mental retardation. That's the term that they used at the time. And she actually did that before he was even in office. So when he was elected, she really prevailed upon him to develop this panel, which he did. And that really set the stage for making intellectual and developmental disabilities a national priority. And the panel made over 100 recommendations with emphasis on, training and training of teachers, research. Mrs. Shriver was very clear that treatment and interventions needed to be evidence-based, which is something that we hold very dear today. And, at the time, there was really a struggle between research to prevent intellectual and developmental disabilities or to intervene and treat. And she really sort of pushed that both were important, and that supporting people and their families was of primary importance. And the employment of people with intellectual disabilities was important. So this panel was really quite front and center for setting that national agenda and setting that those priorities. And that led to the passage of the federal legislation that was crafted in 1963, which was the Mental Retardation Facilities and Construction Act, which actually led to developing these university-affiliated facilities and other programs around the country that were devoted to diagnosis, treatment, research, and training for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And President Kennedy signed it not too much before he was assassinated. And so that legislation kind of wended its way, and several years later, the Shriver Center, where we are, at UMass Medical School was actually established in Waltham, Massachusetts, first affiliated actually with Mass General Hospital, and was kind of a standalone program. It was actually on the grounds of the Fernald State School as a liaison to that institution to better treat and care for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So that's how we got started. And, thanks to federal legislation at that time, and then others that have come since then, we've been able to carry out her vision, which is to have a program of research that benefits people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. We have a very large training program that trains clinicians and leaders in the field. We provide services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. And so we feel like we're doing what Mrs. Shriver wanted us to do.
On screen, a photo of Mary Beth McMahon looking up and smiling at a Special Olympics competitor.
And I can speak for Special Olympics. I mean, it was started in her backyard.
Mary Beth McMahon.
So Tim Shriver likes to say, and it's probably very true, and Jean, you could probably speak to this as well, is that it was really her relationship with her sister Rosemary, which who was very good in sports, even though she was intellectually disabled. So that's where she kind of had the idea on the shores of Hyannis, but the actual first Special Olympics event was at her home in Potomac when she did a backyard summer camp for individuals with intellectual disabilities, and her children and nieces and nephews were the volunteers of those day camps. And so those day camps grew into our first games, which were in Chicago in 1968. And she was, leading that very faithfully, like she did everything else with Special Olympics. But I would say the reason why it continues to grow is, again, we all know she would not have been happy until every individual with intellectual disabilities across the world was involved. And Tim would tell a story that he went to China for the first time and we had games. And as many people know, the Chinese government does not actually look upon individuals with disabilities, children, very well. And so Tim decided to try and get the World Games there in 2007, and that were very successful. And he got off the plane here back in the United States and said to Mrs. Shriver, we got China, we're going to China for World Games, we're going to change the way people look at individuals with intellectual disabilities. And she said, well, how many athletes did you get? And he's like, well, Mom, I just got the games there. I didn't get any athletes yet. And she's like, well, then go back and get some athletes involved. So that was just the way she ran her world when it came to us. And I think that's kind of what keeps us moving and growing at this point.
I'd just like to add that
Diana
the
Bianchi,
programs that
MD.
Carol was describing, the NIH has supported them now for almost 60 years. So I think originally there were 12 of these university affiliated centers, and now we fund 13 of them through our institute. And it's really, there are so few programs that have that kind of continuous support, but that demonstrates not only her legacy, her vision, but our commitment to continue to help investigators implement that vision.
And there are actually additional university affiliated centers that are funded by the Administration on Community Living. And so actually there's the IDDRCs that you have at NIH, and then there are additional ones. So her reach has really been quite far reaching. And a lot of federal funding has come from what she and her brother and her brothers, because Senator Ted Kennedy was also quite influential in Congress in terms of allocating resources for intellectual and developmental disabilities. So it did all start with Mrs. Shriver, and as Dr. Bianchi said, we're talking about 60 years now of funding and support and service, and it actually continues to grow.
While we're the subject of Senator Ted Kennedy, the institute was not originally named
Diana Bianchi,
in honor of
MD.
Mrs. Shriver. It wasn't named until 2007, when Senator Kennedy put forth a bill that eventually became Public Law 110-54. This act of Congress renamed our institute to add Eunice Kennedy Shriver at the front end. And very few of the programs at NIH do carry a person's name, so it is unique. It's also a mouthful when I tell people what I do, but it is such an appropriate testament to her legacy.
I would imagine your business card needs to be pretty sizable to fit all that on there. Okay, let's move on to the next question. How does the work of your organization, each of your organizations today, and maybe beyond that, the work you personally do within your organization, carry out Mrs. Shriver's legacy?
You've heard what everybody said so far about Eunice, but I think the thing that just sticks with me so powerfully is the fact that she had the reputation for deep held beliefs to support the dignity of everyone. And everything she did was with fierce passion. You've heard this from some. She was very single-minded, and she used her passion, rooted in her relationship with her sister, to do what she did, to fuel, getting funding, establishing infrastructure and mechanisms. And I really feel like it's because of her deep belief and passion that we actually exist. The Eunice Kennedy Shriver Center exists because of her. And we are carrying out her deep held beliefs. Our mission is deep, and we have a rich history of supporting research, education, and service, as Carol outlined earlier. And it's all aimed at improving the quality of life of persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. And I would add that it's really critical to include the families, because the whole family is impacted. We really are focused on empowering folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities so that they lead their fullest lives. And that includes across the board, getting adequate access to healthcare, helping them transition into the adult role, gaining successful employment. So I really believe, and the cool thing about the Shriver Center, and I'll just finish with this, is we have very impassioned employees, faculty and staff, and not all, but many have had their lives touched magically by individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So they bring that lived experience to their daily work. And like Eunice, we carry that torch forward.
I would say that every day
Diana
we carry
Bianchi,
out Mrs. Shriver's legacy. Fairly recently, with just prior to the pandemic, we had a strategic planning exercise that resulted in a new strategic plan. And as part of that, we refreshed our mission and vision statements. And so I'm just going to read you the mission statement because it echoes Eunice everywhere. So NICHD leads research and training to understand human development, improve reproductive health, enhance the lives of children and adolescents, and optimize abilities for all. So it incorporates all of the themes for which she was very passionate. I mean, she was very passionate about the health of pregnant women as well, and making sure that there was a healthy pregnancy. And actually our vision statement is healthy pregnancies, healthy children, healthy and optimal lives. So that's what we're trying to accomplish, which is a direct implementation of her vision as well.
I think I can add something just a little different in that
Beth Mcmahon.
We recently celebrated, well, not as recent as I would hope, time flies. In 2018, we celebrated our 50th anniversary, and we did a big celebration at the JFK Library. And something that motivates me today to kind of move this organization forward is when you think back to the 1960s, when Mrs. Shriver was doing a lot of this work, it was a pretty crazy time in this world. And, Governor Baker spoke at our 50th anniversary celebration. And he said, out of 1968, this mission about inclusion and acceptance was born. And when you look around now, the world is just as crazy, if not more crazy, because you're adding a pandemic to it and all the political infighting and everything. And if she can build this beloved organization from the late 60s, then we certainly can build it back from a world we are currently in, even adding the pandemic.
I know, Mary Beth, you mentioned
Melody
this.
Mendez.
Perhaps one or two of you had an opportunity to meet or work with Eunice Shriver. Mary Beth, I'd love to hear more from you about your encounters with her. It sounds like she was a really tough boss, but in a really great way.
On screen, a photo of Mary Beth McMahon looking up and smiling at a Special Olympics competitor.
She was a force.
Mary Beth McMahon.
Look back on it, hindsight's 2020. I would say to this day, she's probably the greatest person I've ever worked for. But that's with hindsight. I would say that if you saw her coming at you at an event, you knew you were in trouble. It was very rarely for praise. It was very rarely for what you were not doing enough of or not accomplishing enough of. And there's so many stories across Special Olympics. And I will say that to us, we were fearful of her. Like, I will honestly say, if she came at you for a reason that was not positive. But to the athletes, she never, ever treated them in any way, shape, or form, but with the utmost respect. So she might be mad at you or wanting you to do more, but that athlete had done the most accomplished thing they'd ever done in their life. And she really had that passion for the athletes and what they were accomplishing at that moment. And we were their support system. And she was very obvious about that from the beginning. So she could turn around and be upset with you and pushing you to do better, but she would turn immediately back around to the other side without even like having to move. And she'd be as kind as can be and as respectful as can be to the athlete that may or may not have accomplished a personal best. And so I think from an athlete standpoint, you would hear significantly different stories than you would from the people that volunteered and worked for her, because it was to us, she was giving her mission, and it was to them that she was making sure it existed.
It's no secret that generations have felt her impact, mine included. I first learned about Eunice during the 40th anniversary gala at Harvard University back in 2008. And Nelson Mandela said it best when describing her as a pioneer who literally changed the way persons with disabilities are treated and viewed, not only in the United States, but in Africa and around the world. I mean, that gala, that evening at Harvard, where I made that speech of mine, I learned so much about Eunice Kennedy Shriver that evening than ever before. I mean, it's hard to come up with the words to describe it all. What she did, I mean, her actions, I mean, her friendships with people like me, people with disabilities. I mean, she set the bar high. She set an example, not only to herself, not only to her family, but to the world. I mean, she brought kindness and compassion everywhere she went. I'm obviously disappointed that I didn't get to meet her, but she was the one person in this world that brought people like me out of the shadows.
I never met Mrs. Shriver, but I
Diana
thoroughly
Bianchi,
enjoyed reading the biography of her written by Eileen McNamara. And the subtitle was The Kennedy Who Changed the World. And what an appropriate title that was for the book. I mean, that book is filled with anecdotes that describe and illustrate her incredible laser focus on her mission and vision. I mean, many of them go along with what Mary Beth had mentioned as well. I mean, one of the stories that I remember was her baby blue, was it a Lincoln Continental? And she was so focused on getting to her office and getting to work that she would park the car in a garage, but never take note where it was. And then she would throw the keys to her assistant and tell the assistant to go get the car, but the assistant had no idea where the car was. And just things like that. She pinned notes, like probably before Post-it notes were available. She would pin notes to her sweaters for things that she wanted to remember to do. She just, every day and all night long as well. She was on the phone advocating for people with disabilities. I mean, she was a human dynamo.
On screen, a photo of Mary Beth McMahon looking up and smiling at a Special Olympics competitor.
I think I'd also add one more thing. I think her
Beth
legacy
McMahon
shines through her children and her grandchildren. Not one of the Shriver children have not gone into public service. And I think that's a credit to her and Sarge. He was a gentle soul who adored her. And those 5 children are all about service and all about making sure there's equality to some aspect of this world. And I think that's one of her key legacies, is that, all of us, I think, know Tim. I know Mark very well. I've met all of them at some point. And the reality is that they just are faith-based, wonderful humans. And that is, I think, one of the biggest legacies Sarge and Mrs. Shriver left in this world, is because Tim has carried on, and Tim's children and Mark's children are all carrying on as well. So that's a legacy that we'll always forever have.
Okay, well, I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today and sharing your thoughts on Eunice Kennedy Shriver's legacy on the 100th anniversary of her birth in Brookline, Mass. As someone who grew up in a foster home with many foster brothers and sisters of differing abilities, and now the aunt of a beautiful young girl with developmental disabilities, I am in awe and inspired by the work you all do, and continue to appreciate everything you've done every day. So thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us here today. It is greatly appreciated.
On screen is a 6-person shot.
Thank you. It's our pleasure.
Mendez in the upper left corner.
What an honor.
Surrounded by 5 panelists.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Hi, everybody.
On screen, a nameplate appears in the upper left. David Lenz, Eunice Kennedy Shriver portrait artist, winner of the Outwin Bouvier portrait competition. David is wearing glasses and wearing a black shirt.
My name is David Lenz, and I'm an artist, a portrait painter. 16 years ago, I was extraordinarily fortunate to win the first prize in a nationwide portrait competition organized by the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery. The painting that I entered was actually of my son, Sam.
On screen are photos of David's son, Sam, a Special Olympics competitor wearing a red windbreaker, glasses, and a big smile.
At the time, he was just 8 years old, a bright and funny kid, huge sports fan, and an avid Special Olympics athlete. Sam was born with Down syndrome. Part of the first prize was a commission to paint a portrait of a remarkable American for the Portrait Gallery's permanent collection. It could have been anyone in the entire United States, but the Portrait Gallery and I agreed Eunice Kennedy Shriver was the perfect choice. Mrs. Shriver, of course, was well known for founding Special Olympics, but she had done so much more. She had led a human rights movement to bring people with intellectual disabilities out of the shadows after a long and horrible history of being marginalized, belittled, and worst of all, shut away from society. To discuss the portrait, Mrs. Shriver and I met at her Maryland home in the summer of 2007. She walked in, shook my hand, sat down, and said, "What can I do for you?" She was all business. At the time of the meeting, there was still some question as to whether Mrs. Shriver would actually agree to sit for the portrait. Later, I learned that she had declined many opportunities to have a building or a scholarship fund named after her, preferring instead to stay behind the scenes as much as anybody in her position could. But Mrs. Shriver's staff told me that she would do anything for Special Olympics athletes, and she would do anything for the parents of the athletes. And so I pulled off photos of my son, Sam, competing in Special Olympics, and the tone of the meeting changed. She studied each photograph, asked questions, and commented Sam's a very handsome young man. And then I gave a letter that Sam had written to Mrs. Shriver, and in it, he asked for her to start more and more and more Special Olympics. She took a moment, and then right there in the middle of our meeting, she wrote a letter back to him, congratulating him on his participation. It was so sweet. And we were on our way. She had agreed to sit for the portrait. Then Mrs. Shriver said something that became sort of a guiding principle behind the portrait. She said, people with intellectual disabilities are a part of humanity. They have dignity, soul, spirit, and they are part of the community. They have a destiny. And finally, as a completely natural extension of her life's work, we decided to add 5 Special Olympic athletes to the portrait.
On screen is a photo of the portrait of Eunice Kennedy Shriver as David is describing it.
To share the spotlight with her for all time. So from left to right, we have Erica Straka, Katie Mead, Andy Leonard, Loretta Claiborne, of course, Mrs. Shriver, and Marty Sheets. In the portrait, quite simply, Mrs. Shriver is leading us all out of the darkness of that troubled past and into the light of acceptance, understanding, and community. Illuminating the scene is the light of Mrs. Shriver's work, so far-reaching, so beautiful in its apparent simplicity. All are created equal, that it's like a ring of sunlight suspended in the sky. And Erica, the youngest member of the group, has recognized what a rare and beautiful sight this is, Mrs. Shriver's work. And she's looking over her shoulder, beckoning us all to see it too. It's been an extreme honor to be a part of this celebration of Mrs. Shriver's life and legacy. Thank you to the National Park Service and to the Friends of the JFK Birthplace for this tremendous opportunity.
I'm Mark Schwartz.
On screen, a nameplate appears. Mark Schwartz, Board President, Friends of the JFK Birthplace. Mark is wearing glasses and a red shirt.
Board President of the Friends of the JFK Birthplace. We're the nonprofit community partner organization to the National Park Service at John Fitzgerald Kennedy National Historic Site. Our purpose is to provide volunteer, financial, public outreach, and advocacy support to this important historic site in Brookline, Massachusetts. We and the other organizations presenting this event, the National Park Service, Special Olympics Massachusetts, and the Eunice Kennedy Shriver Center at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, wish to thank you for viewing this program, celebrating Eunice Kennedy Shriver's life and legacy on what would have been her 100th birthday. We hope you come away with a greater appreciation of Mrs. Shriver as a person, as a Kennedy family member, and as passionate advocate for equality and inclusion of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We would like to thank the many program participants, with special shout outs to Timothy Shriver and his colleagues at Special Olympics International, and our many panelists and speakers who volunteered their time and energy to this endeavor. We also thank our media partners, NBC 10 Boston and Brookline Interactive Group, the latter through its staff person, Corbin Rydell, recording and editing all components of this virtual program. Please join the Friends of the JFK Birthplace and John Fitzgerald Kennedy National Historic Site for future programs and events, mostly in person, we hope. For more information and to join the email list,
text appears on screen. Friends of the JFK Birthplace, Brookline, Massachusetts, jfkfriends@gmail.com, 617-566-7937, extension 16.
For our nonprofit friends group at the Kennedy site, please email jfkfriends@gmail.com. That's jfkfriends, all consecutive, @gmail.com. Thank you.